Tonight's seminar is going to look at writing the history of secret intelligence. But first, I just wanted to make a plug for the next seminar, because we'll be taking a break over Easter and we'll reconvene on Wednesday, the 24th of April, for a session on historical engagement with policymakers, featuring Dr. Christopher Knowles and our co-convener, Philip Murphy, who's Director of History and Policy. So do register via the IHR website to join us for that session on the 24th of April. But back to tonight, and we're going to hear from two speakers tonight. My former colleague and former FCO chief historian, Gill Bennett, who spent a career working as a historian within government. And she's going to speak on travels in the missing dimension, writing official histories of secret intelligence. But first, we're going to hear from Declan O'Reilly, a visiting fellow at King's College London, and he'll be talking about politics and history of British intelligence during the Second World War. So can I please remind you to remain muted unless you're asking a question. And if you do have a question or comment, please pop it in the chat at any time, but we'll pick them up after both of the speakers have given their presentations. As you probably know by now, this session will be recorded and eventually uploaded to the History and Policy website, where previous seminars in the series have already been uploaded. So without further ado, Declan, can I turn the floor over to you?
Okay. The usual caveats. This is still a work in progress, so I mean my ideas are changing as we speak. So, in July 1969, Sir Dick White, ex-head of both MI5 and the Secret Intelligence Service, now Whitehall's coordinator of intelligence, presented a report on the possibility of writing a history of Britain's secret intelligence services in World War II. The fundamental question on the table was what kind of history, if any, should the state commission? This meeting did not suddenly materialise from nowhere and was closely connected with radical changes in access to public records in Britain. It was part of what Chris Moran has termed counterblast, a strategy to deflect attention away from the secret state through the use of officially inspired leaks to specific authors, initially organised through Admiral Denning's D-Notice Committee, which is Britain's press self-censorship organisation. The counterblast was part of a battle of books, prized the reputation, if not the soul, of Britain's intelligence services, a literary battle that began with Philby's defection to Moscow in 1963 and ended with the Spycatcher debacle. Before 1967, government records were withheld from public scrutiny for 50 years, something reaffirmed in the 1958 Act of Parliament. However, by the 1960s, this was felt to be too restrictive. Demands for greater freedom of information, especially about the recent grew. This pressure, emanating from a wide public, which included historians, journalists, lawyers, other academics, and ordinary people, prompted the Labour Party to commit itself to new legislation. In 1967, a bill was passed to reduce the 50-year rule to 30. Significantly, despite the draconian Official Secrets Act, Whitehall was not against controlled disclosure. Sir Burke Trend, the Cabinet Secretary, the nation's top civil servant, felt that the 50-year rule was too restrictive and served only to prevent British historians from systematically addressing serious historical issues like decolonisation. In late 1963, Trend visited the then Prime Minister Alec Douglas Hume, arguing that unless things changed, the public would base their judgments on partial information, partisan members, incomplete and biased histories, and official accounts by other countries. However, the new 30-year limit posed serious problems. Within a very short space of time, wartime records would be available to researchers. This caused deep consternation in the secret state. Diligent historians, let alone less scrupulous writers, could expose things the British government wanted to remain undisclosed. Chief among these secrets was the 20 Committee, the double cross system, and Bletchley Park's cryptographic success against the German Enigma signals traffic. Whitehall had a second concern. Various former members of the secret state, angry and depressed by the damage done by the recent spy scandals to the reputation of both MI5 and MI6, keen to publish details of their major successes against the Germans. The civil service feared this could not be prevented. The government thought the D-Notice Committee did not want to be in the invidious position of having to continually answer questions from authors relating to the wartime activities of the still unacknowledged secret state. This problem was brought into sharp relief by the Sunday Times 1967 Insight investigation into the career of Kim Philby, an SAS officer and long-term Soviet spy. Philby's problem was especially galling to the secret state. Questions were already being asked about how he had managed to remain undetected for so long. Ferreting through open sources, the Insight team showed just how effective dedicated investigative journalists could be. Insight produced a devastating portrait of an amateur, in the worst sense of that word, secret world. Establishment heavy, hidebound by class, and riven by jealousy and incompetence. To make matters worse, in 1968, Philby published My Silent War, a mendacious memoir whose aim was to denigrate SAS and sow dissension between it and the Americans. With considerable glee, Philby proceeded to present his erstwhile colleagues as at best inept and at worst ruthless, venal, and corrupt, spending more time in bureaucratically motivated infighting than combating the Nazis. Now, Philby's mean-spirited attack on his former colleagues galvanized various ex-members of the secret state to seeking government permission once again to tell their stories. Chief among these were John Masterman and F.W. Winterbotham. Both men were keen to publish their accounts of Double Cross and the Ultra Enigma, but had been steadfastly refused permission. In both cases, patience was wearing thin. The aging Masterman, Knight of the Realm, Oxford Don, historian, novelist, provost of Worcester College, and wartime secretary to the 20 Committee, wanted action soon. In 1945, he was commissioned to write a detailed history of the whole Double Cross enterprise. In contrast to other historians engaged in writing similar how-to reports, Masterman, in defiance of the Official Secrets Act, purloined a copy and took it back to Oxford. The bound manuscript adorned the panelled bookshelves of his college room, a curiosity which he enjoyed tantalizing students. In the wake of the bad press MI5 was receiving due to Dender's spy scandal, Masterman, proud of his old service, had been seeking permission to publish since the early 1960s. Continually rebuffed by Her Majesty's government, the octogenarian Don now turned his sights on publishing in America, a country perfectly willing to ignore any strictures or demands by a British government. The endless public interest in espionage, the secret state's dislike of Philby having the last word, coupled with the fear that journalistically inclined writers would, with the help of foreign, especially US archives, comb through the newly released documents to uncover Double Cross and Enigma, all gave Trend pause to think. In his view, the counterblast strategy worked up to a point. However, if the intelligence service's reputation was deemed, bold action was necessary. Trend also felt there was a debt to history. Too many bunk books perpetuating intelligence myths had been published. Moreover, the official histories of World War II were all misleading, since they did not allude to the role of intelligence at all. Now, White's report suggested four possible solutions: a full-scale history for publication, a limited history again for publication, a full-scale secret history intended only for officials, or a secret limited history without guarantee of publication. The committee rejected the first solution, but was undecided about the others. White, however, felt the whole point of the exercise to show British intelligence in the best light, arguing, quote, "Unless plans are laid for the sponsorship of official history, the waters are likely to become increasingly muddy, to the detriment not only of the reputation of British intelligence, but also of security," end quote. Trend, agreeing with White, wrote to Harold Wilson rhetorically stating, "Are we really doing ourselves justice by maintaining a total embargo on any official account of our intelligence record during the war?" Even with the heavyweight backing from both the Cabinet Secretary and the Coordinator, there was opposition. Secret services were worried about the American reaction. Any full history would inescapably show the US intelligence services as junior partners in the clandestine war, something the CIA, a massive organization, might find deeply embarrassing. Furthermore, some secret warriors felt that exposing Enigma's penetration of the Nazi signals traffic to the harsh light of politics might lead to the growth of a new stab in the back legend in Germany. Cognizant of these fears, Trend offered a compromise solution: a limited history that concentrated on intelligence use, how consumers interpreted the intelligence material rather than its collection. In late July, Trend put this idea to Harold Wilson, emphasizing the political advantages of possible publication. The history would forestall accusations that the government was being unnecessarily restrictive toward the writing of intelligence history. And another benefit was that by pointing to the forthcoming official publication, ministers could ease the strain on the Dean of the committee through refusing requests for access to closed sections of the archives. This was a clinching argument with Wilson, and in April 1970 he authorized the history. Despite this success, there were other political problems to cross before the project could begin. Opposition party leaders and the Americans had to be consulted. White wrote to the CIA Director Richard Helms, a man notoriously closed-mouthed about the secret world, explaining the motivations for the history. Helms surprised everyone by offering his prompt and unqualified support, but privately he told his officials to read any files that British researchers wanted to see. Edward Heath, on the other hand, leader of the Conservatives, was instinctively against the project. Moreover, however, he agreed to consult Tory grandees, Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, and Lord Swinton, all former consumers of secret intelligence. All three reinforced his reluctance to consent to any written history. In July, the government changed and Heath became Prime Minister. And Trend quickly heightened Heath's sensitivity to the dangers of not publishing an official account. Other authors were straining at the bit to go public with their versions of key secrets. John Masterman was agitating to publish his 20-committee report at Yale University Press, while at the same time helping an American author, Laszlo Farago, bring out a book called Game of the Foxes, a account of the German Abwehr's espionage against the UK, which also threatened to expose the whole double-cross system. He also pointed out that with secret histories and how-to reports written at the end of the war, history could be commissioned without any direct promise of publication. Despite these reservations, in February 1971, Heath agreed there was to be a multi-volume history that included strategic intelligence, operational intelligence, counterintelligence, and strategic deception. The history would also be a multi-skilled effort by a team of historians under the leadership of a general editor. The government's expectation was that the history would take 2 years and at an estimated cost of the Treasury of between £30,000 and £60,000. A steering committee was set up composed of academic historians chosen for their professional eminence, but also their personal experience of intelligence work. Chaired by James Butler, it included such luminaries as F.W. Deakin, Hugh Trevor Roper, and Sir Michael Howard, who would eventually be commissioned to write Volume 5 on strategic deception when its original author, Colonel Peter Fleming, died in late 1971. The next stage, that was ironically, it was not only did Peter Fleming die, but the second commissioned author died as well before Michael Howard took it over. The next stage was to find a team of trustworthy and reliable historians. The clear frontrunner for the editorship was Sir Harry Hinsley, ex-Bletchley Park codebreaker, Professor of International Relations at Cambridge, and Master of St John's College. Hinsley was an excellent choice, as his Bletchley experience gave him a nuanced grasp of what could and could not be revealed about secret intelligence. Even so, things took longer than expected. It took over 5 years to complete the first manuscript. In 1969, the Secret Services had agreed to cooperate with the project by making relevant files available. MI5 and GCHQ made good on their promise. Sticking point was SIS. It flatly refused Hinsley and its team access to any of its records. The biggest problem was identifying human intelligence, many of whom cooperated with Britain on a promise that their identities would never be revealed. And mindful of the problem of identifying individual agents in MRD Foote's book, SOE in France, Trend suggested there was a special set of anonymous references to be devised to protect secret sources. Despite SIS intransigence and obstructionism, Hinsley and his team persisted, producing 2 volumes by the late 1970s. By then, the situation and publication had changed radically. Both Double Cross and Enigma were now in the public domain. Even so, the manuscript underwent a long process of sanitization, where every paragraph was scrutinized by government readers, but also by the American and Commonwealth Authority. The new Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan, who had resigned in 1976, now had to decide whether to publish or not. As the history had been commissioned by a Conservative government in May 1978, Jim Callaghan wrote to Margaret Thatcher, now leader of the opposition, seeking her opinion. Thatcher was profoundly opposed to publication. In her view, the Secret Services should remain secret. She wrote back expressing disquiet at the prospect. Whatever the level of sanitization text, she believed it still endangered national security. Do we really, she asked, have to lay bare to those who would profit from it not only what intelligence we had, but how we interpreted it? Moreover, she was unimpressed by American endorsement. In reference to the CIA's public drubbing before the Senate Church Committee, she argued, and I quote, "I have little confidence in their judgment on publication matters," end quote. Plaintively, she added, do I really have much input on this? She concluded, quote, I was taught a very good rule by my 2 masters in law, both of whom are now judges. Never admit anything unless you have to, and then only for specific reason and within defined limits. It's a rule that has stood me in good stead in many a complicated matter, end quote. Jim Callaghan disagreed. In his view, the history was a scholarly, comprehensive and dispassionate work. Volume 1 on strategic intelligence was published to great acclaim in 1979, critics seeing it as a significant contribution to public understanding of World War II. Walter LeCure, writing in New Republic, called it a political event which would necessitate rewriting the histories of World War II. Not everybody was so fulsome in their praise. Sir Maurice Oldfield, ex-head of SAS, called it a book written by a committee, about committees, for committees. Oldfield's carping aside, went a long way to restore the secret state's reputation, which was part of its purpose. Moreover, this was dramatically undone by the Blunt-Farrago in November. Revelations that Sir Anthony Blunt, distinguished professor of art history and royal servant, had been granted immunity from prosecution as a Soviet spy, exploded like a bombshell. Deeply embarrassed, after having to make a public statement to the House of Commons, Mrs. Thatcher, now Prime Minister, put an immediate block on the history's further publication. Compounded by issues related to the Spycatcher disaster, the key volumes on counterintelligence, by Hinsley and Simpkins, as well as Michael Howard's book on strategic deception, completed in 1980, did not see the light of day until 1990. Now, whatever its faults, Hinsley's history was a major scholarly achievement and a vital contribution to the historiography of World War II. It was also a milestone in the British state's journey towards greater openness. However, this was not its purpose. Information control was. By its very nature, intelligence history suffers from more than its fair share of shock reporting, conspiracy theory, and fantasy. But as Chris Moran suggests, official history gives the secret state a voice in a crowded marketplace of journalism, populist histories, and memoirs. From the state's point of view, official history deflects and delays difficult decisions regarding declassification. The recent histories of MI5 and MI6 are a case in point. MI5 released a large number of files from 1909 to 1945, while the Secret Intelligence Service, its archives remain closed to researchers. However, Harry Hinsley and his team did produce an excellent introduction to the significance of intelligence in World War II. For that, all serious historians should be grateful. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think, yeah, there's some immediate parallels that we can see with previous sessions there about the government trying to take hold of the narrative and with varying successes. But let's hold over discussion until we've heard from Gill. So Gill, do you want to come in with your presentation?
Yes, I'm going to try and share my screen. So let's see if this works.
Yep.
Can you see it? Whoops. No.
No, I can't.
Just a moment. It says preparing. So it's thinking.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Something's happening.
Can you see it now?
Yes, thanks.
Oh, I seem to be popped up in the bottom of the screen, which is a bit. However, let's see how we get on. As Richard said, I was an official historian in Whitehall for nearly 50 years, principally as a member of the Foreign Office historians, including, as Richard said, being chief historian. But in terms of intelligence records, I've also worked for the Cabinet Office between 2008 2016 and was privileged to be a member of the research team on the official history of MI6 between 2006 2010. And I'm also, of course, an official historian myself, in that I published an official history commissioned by the Cabinet Office based on privileged access, a biography of Churchill's intelligence advisor, Desmond Morton, and indeed my book on the Zinoviev letter, which made use of information that I had access to in the history note, which was published in 1999. I was also closely involved with getting out, if you like, the first releases of the files of the Foreign Office Permanent Under Secretary's Department, that is the department responsible for liaison between the Foreign Office and the intelligence agencies, and indeed the Cabinet Secretary's secret and personal archive. And if we have time at the end, I'll talk a little bit more about those. But my principal focus tonight is to talk a little bit about how the Foreign Office historians have used intelligence in pursuit of their dual remit, that is, firstly, producing the official documentary History of British Foreign Policy, and first the interwar series DBFP and later DBPO. And the second part, which is to provide advice to ministers and senior officials, which usually or quite often involves producing different publications such as history notes, indeed like the Zinoviev one. Just a couple of general points first. There's a number of places, of course, that one can find intelligence records in Whitehall. It may be within departments themselves, with records that have not yet been reviewed and released, or indeed are exempt from that, but that doesn't mean that the historians can't use them. The records of the intelligence agencies themselves, records of things like the Joint Intelligence Committee, I've mentioned PUSD and so on. I mentioned forgotten cupboards because there are, over the years, there have been more than a few examples where people have found files in the bottom of presses, locked presses, that nobody had remembered they had. This indeed happened when I was working in SIS with the MI6 history, when somebody came round to our office one day with 2 red boxes and said, "We found this in our press. We thought before throwing them away, we'd see if the history team might want them." And they turned out to be an invaluable set of, in fact, PUSD records, so they belong to the Foreign Office anyway. So I just mentioned these sources. I also want to mention, if you like, the basic rules about our using intelligence material. Firstly, I mean, this is all really motherhood and apple pie, but I think it always bears repeating. Remembering that intelligence is only ever one part of the picture in the formulation of foreign policy. It is rare for intelligence to be decisive, but it can, of course, provide vital context. And to remember always, and this certainly is something that I often tell students and so on, that just because a piece of intelligence information is highly classified or indeed seems really sexy, it doesn't mean it's important. It doesn't mean it had any influence. You have to look and see what was actually done with it before you're deciding whether it's influential. And the other thing is that, you know, as obviously a government employees, to understand and accept the rule of the importance of protecting sources and methods in perpetuity. This is sometimes difficult for people to take on board, especially when we're talking about a period of very, very long time ago. But working in foreign policy, you get to know that there are many governments in the world who have extremely long memories, and that if it were to be revealed that people had in their family had given information to the British in a previous generation, would immediately have very negative effects on their families. So you do have to, sometimes, of course, it's become public for other reasons, but you have to follow those rules. I also want to say a quick word about privileged access before moving on to that. Now, it's just important to remember that privileged access granted to official historians, whether they're internal ones like the Foreign Office historians, or indeed people who are commissioned to write specific books, does not confer the automatic right to publication. All the material, if you decide you want to use it in a publication, has to be vetted. This may be just within the Foreign Office itself, but it may also be for important documents or manuscripts that deal with a great many departments. There are large interdepartmental committees, and I myself served on the vetting committee for the official history of the Falklands conflict, for example, by Lawrence Freedman, indeed for the MI5 history by Chris Andrew, and indeed in the project for bringing out the Mitrokian material. So I do know how this works. Now, in principle, the Foreign Office historians have always had privileged access, but for many years, this did not really involve intelligence. And indeed, for those who've seen our fairly recent publication by the Abadan report by Rowan Butler in the early 60s, he complains in that document about not being allowed access to information. So for many years, if we wanted to know if there was an intelligence context to a particular issue, we had to sort of submit a request through various channels, and we might or might not get a reply. But then all this changed for several reasons during the mid-1990s. Now, the principal reason for the change in all this is the fact that the intelligence agencies were then put on a statutory basis. Before that, you could not admit that Britain had intelligence agencies. The existence of them was not avowed. And that meant, of course, that a lot of files being released to the National Archives were redacted or indeed held back because they talked about the work of agencies that technically did not exist. And this legislation, so in 1989, the Security Service Act, which very if you like, in an elegant way, admitted, so there shall continue to be a security service, thereby admitting that MI5 had existed. Now, of course, everybody knew that, but you weren't allowed to say so, and the historians were not allowed to write about it. The SIS and GCHQ equivalent, the Intelligence Services Act 1994, including the setting up of the Oversight Committee, and then the Act was amended to give MI5 responsibilities in organised crime. data protection and freedom of information I've mentioned because in those early days of the legislation, we historians were very closely involved with fielding requests for information under both those pieces of legislation, and quite often people were asking for intelligence material. Once these acts had been passed, we were immediately free to talk about the existence of the agencies. Indeed, you were even allowed to mention their chiefs, and that did make quite a big difference. Now, the other thing, bizarrely, because it actually had nothing to do with intelligence, that opened up the historians' close contact with the agencies was the whole raft of issues loosely called Nazi gold, which arose out of one of those accusations, this time by Greville Janner, later Lord Janner, now deceased, who had written to the Foreign Secretary accusing the government of a major cover-up of top secret material about what had happened to gold during the Second World War, and particularly what neutral countries had done with them. Now, these documents, which Janner and his colleagues had obtained via FOIA in the States, were actually not secret documents at all. They and indeed we were able to point out that they'd actually been at the National Archives since 1972. But that's too late. Ministers, when these kind of things happen, ministers come under attack. They have a tendency to stand up in the House of Commons and say, I've ordered a full investigation. And that usually comes down to the historians. And this is what happened in 1996. And from the point of view of historians' use of intelligence, what happened that to show transparency, we did actually have to look at the intelligence archives to show that the ones he was talking about weren't there, and it led to our publications. So there's a big change from the mid-90s onwards, and we started to work a lot more closely with the intelligence agencies. And what I want to do is talk just a little bit about some of the ways that the Foreign Office historians used it. Now, the first one, of course, is in the question of actually including intelligence-related documentation in the official series DBPO. And that started to happen in a case where we would discover that all of a sudden the documentation in the mainstream Foreign Office files seemed to go into a rabbit hole and disappear. And this happened in particular with the case of the exchange in 1969 of Gerald Brooke for the Soviet spies, the Krugers, or rather the Cohens as they were actually called, and in particular Operation Foot, the expulsion of 105 Soviet intelligence officers in 1971. And we have the story up to a certain point in the mainstream files, and then it disappeared. And we argued successfully that we must be allowed to see the PUSD files on this. And that led for the first time to such documentation being included in the first volume of Series 3. And the picture I've got, I know it's not very clear, but there was a most fantastic launch in 1998 of this volume, which people who are unfortunately no longer alive, but people who'd actually been involved. Dennis Healy was there, Callahan was there, Crispin Tickell was there, and Sir John Killick, who'd been in Moscow, was there. And the whole thing was chaired by the then PUS Sir John Kerr, who began the proceedings by saying, welcome, ladies, gentlemen, and friends with a capital F. So this really brought us much more into the use of intelligence in our volumes. But the other way is, of course, that intelligence material can provide essential context in a much less public way. One example I'd just like to mention is that in an earlier volume, when we've been talking about documenting Attlee's visit to Washington in November 1945, we found that documentation was extremely difficult to find. And we had actually put in a request to see if there was any intelligence material, and we really hadn't got an answer. But then when we were able to access the PUSD files, we found all the documentation relating to the Corby case, that is the defection of Igor Kutsenko in September 45. And that's all going on under the surface at the time of Attlee's visit. And it made the whole thing a lot more understandable, and we could deal with it a lot better. They're also helpful in explaining organisational developments in the agencies and in the general Whitehall management of intelligence. We found that both in the PUSD files and indeed in the Cabinet Secretary's file. Now, another important way in which the Foreign Office historians have used intelligence material is dealing with conspiracy theories, which have beset historians. I mean, I joined the historians in 1972, and they were already dealing with some of these. I mean, there's too many to go into. Zinoviev letter, obvious, is a hardy perennial. Some of these have now thankfully been resolved, like the fate of the Romanovs, for example, and Katyn, more or less, and indeed the Casement diaries. But over the years, these came back again and again, and when governments or ministers receive letters denouncing what they always call a government cover-up, it was to the historians that they turned to try and explain. I always used to say my job is not to defend the government's actions in the past, it is to explain what happened. And that often involved access to intelligence records. I will mention, I'm not going to go into all these use. So this is one of the things that can happen to you if you're an official historian dealing with these issues. You will see that on the day that our first Zinoviev report was published, these are two headlines in the press on the same day. The Guardian saying the Zinoviev letter was dirty trick by MI6. The Times says MI6 did not write the Zinoviev letter. And I had to deal with this in a press conference. But I'd like to just mention both the Casement issue, this is to do with the notorious Casement diaries, which were seized when he was arrested and indeed executed in 1916, documenting in great detail homosexual activities with mostly young boys, which for many years the Irish nationalists argued could not possibly be genuine, and that British intelligence, they said, had forged them. And the other one is this question of General Sikorski, and generally dealing with the Polish government. And in both those cases, the way that the historians were asked to take a part, to document, to research, and indeed to speak about these, got completely connected with ongoing political and diplomatic activity. So they're quite difficult to deal with. I mentioned Sikorski because when I was a member of the Anglo-Polish Historical Committee between 2000 and 2005, and that was set up because the Polish government accused the British government of not giving sufficient recognition to Polish intelligence contributions in the Second World War. And there were some extremely heated discussions over the 5 years of that committee. And whenever things were going badly, the Polish side would say to me, "And you killed General Sikorski." Now, we know we didn't. They knew we didn't. All the papers were already out, but it was a useful, it was a leverage point. And it's the kind of thing that the historians have to deal with when they're talking about, it's not just history. It's not just trying to find out what happened. It's also looking at the wider context. The same was true with Casement when I was sent to represent supposedly HMG at a conference in Dublin, which got very bound up with some current negotiations at Hillsborough at the time. And it means you have to be extremely careful what you say and what you do. So it's not all quite as tricky and controversial as that. So I just want to mention this. Sometimes the historians have been able to use intelligence material in order to bring out information that normally not available to the public. Quite often on Holocaust-related issues, there's been quite a lot of that over the years. And the installation of a plaque dedicated to Frank Foley, who had, of course, been an SIS officer in Germany before the war, who had enabled a great many Jews to escape. And a plaque was installed in what was then the new British Embassy in Berlin in 2004. You can see that little picture that on my right in that photograph is Michael Smith, who wrote a book about Foley. It says on my left it's Jeremy Cresswell, but it's not. It's Tony Blishen. But the great thing, we were able to produce a collection of documents for publication about that, and include some SIS documents as well, which made it a much better sort of publication. I would say all these publications, all the history notes and so on, are all available open access on issue.com. So do have a look at them if you're not familiar with them. So I'd just like to finish by having a quick look at these PUSD and CABSEC documents, because they really are quite important. And although I suspect most of the audience here tonight will be familiar with them, you might not all be. So I'm going to have a look. So we had two releases. The first release, which was agreed by Jack Straw when he was Foreign Secretary, we had to submit that these documentation it was actually, it was under the blanket, as they say, it was exempt from release, but we argued that there was lots of material which could be reviewed and released into the public domain. And so in 2005 was the first release, which was 99 pieces, covering, in fact, the early ones, 1873. There's some very early documents which were misfiled again in a, if you like, a forgotten cupboard, but in a forgotten box. They turned up, some of these very pre-First World War documents, completely misfiled. And the Foreign Office historians published a series of essays, also on issue at the time, with sort of tidbits from this. And then in 2013, the second release, covering from the outbreak of the Second World War up to 1951, 476 pieces. And that is really a treasure trove of material which people still don't make enough use of. Now, in parallel with that were the, I'm not going to go into this now, were the Cabinet Secretary's secret and personal archive. Now, the background to that is that over many, many years, successive Cabinet Secretaries had thrown into a basement in Whitehall, a basement room, files and papers on things that are either too difficult, too sensitive, don't know what to do with it, let's lock it up. No, but hope nobody remembers they're there. But by the 2000s, there were too many of them. The room was absolutely full. And first, Sir Richard Wilson, when he was CABSEC, and then when it came to my turn, when Gus O'Donnell was Cabinet Secretary, and Gus said to me, could you have a look through these, see what we can do with them? There must be some papers there, which we can now release. And that was a huge job, because certainly the early papers were often just piles of paper in no particular order, unsorted, unregistered, unnumbered. It was a big job, but they are enormously interesting because they reflect the Cabinet Secretary's coordinating role. So they have this sort of high-level cross-Whitehall role, which includes secret intelligence, and they know what others don't. An example of that is in Operation Foot, because when the key meeting is taken, at which the decision is taken to expel the Soviet intelligence officers, the then Cabinet Secretary, Tren, was the only person in the room, not the ministers, who knew about the internal investigations that had been going on in MI5, which Declan referred to, about Hollis and indeed about other matters. So that made a difference as to how he was looking at the whole question. So these CABSEC files really do illuminate things for us. And I'm just going to finish with two little examples. Incidentally, the review of CABSEC is still going on after I finished with it, and there are currently 1,036 pieces released up to about 1981. But here are two examples of why it was so important. One of the things that I found in this basement room was a complete set of SIS accounts for 1941 to 45, I think it was. And SIS themselves did not have these in their archives because they were handwritten, prepared by Paymaster Percy Sykes for submission to the Treasury, asking for money for operations and indeed for maintenance and everything. And they're great big, full scrap sheets. Here's, you can't really see them, I know, but there they are with the details from August and September 1941. Absolute treasure trove. They are now at Kew and the National Archives. And finally, just for a bit of fun, this 1936 document which was setting out the arrangements for the protection by the police of Mrs. Simpson. This is before the King, Edward VIII, abdicated and he married her. So she was then living in Camden Town, and you can, I know it's not clear to see, but there is the route of what that's supposed to be taken in those little blue steps, where 3 old and experienced constables, it says at the bottom of this document, shall patrol 24 hours a day in 8-hour shifts in order to prevent her from being, well, either harassed by the press or attacked in any way. And this was, again, just a rather ragged sheet of paper found in a basement underneath Whitehall. And, you know, it's a bit of fun, but these things can be very important. I'm very happy to answer questions of any of these things and the ones I haven't been able to talk to, but I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Gill. And I've just popped in the chat the email address of that website that Gill mentioned, on which you can find many of the publications that she was talking about that were published during her time. So do check that out. Thanks to both speakers for keeping to time. So if anybody has any questions or comments, can you drop them in the chat, or put your hand up and I will call you in. I can see John Peaty has his hand up already. So John, do you want to come in and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Richard. Absolutely 2 fascinating talks. Declan, you quoted Sir Maurice Oldfield's remarks on Hinsley et al. About a committee, etc., etc. It's always concerned me that it's very Bletchley heavy. It's very top-down strategic intelligence. It led, I think, to an overstatement of the impact of ultra and of strategic intelligence, high-grade ciphers, at the expense of photo reconnaissance and POW interrogation, for example. Also, I would add that Hinsley completely messed up the Polish contribution, which comes back to what Bill was saying, so much so that he had to publish an appendix in the very last volume, contradicting everything that he'd written in 1979. Do you think these comments are fair?
Well, I think they're fair to a degree. I mean, in practical terms, the history itself is a history of intelligence use. It's basically what the government thought it was doing with intelligence at that point in time. So again, it was designed specifically to prevent people from asking questions about intelligence gathering. And then really, as you say, I mean, it does tend to overbalance slightly the interpretation. But even then, you know, after Winterbottom's book and various other books, even before 1979, the whole the issue of the overbalancing, say, of the Enigma issue is actually quite complicated, because it predated Hinsley's history, and yet Hinsley's history actually concentrates very much on the major achievement of cryptanalysis. And again, that because it's a history of intelligence use, that was the major intelligence use of that period of time. That's how I would interpret it.
And I just asked a supplementary. If there hadn't have been stories, conspiracy theories, coming back to Gill again, about the bombing of Coventry, do you think it would have seen the light of day?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I mean, I don't even think it would have been commissioned. I mean, the influence essentially of the scandals of the 1960s, plus the pressure on the D-Notice Committee, is the reason that actually got the thing going in the first place. Without that kind of pressure, no, Whitehall wouldn't have bothered. Despite the fact that Trend thought, I mean, the 50-year rule was actually too restrictive and needed to actually be reduced. The amount of material that they were expecting to be released into the archive was very large. They were expecting that people would cherry pick it. So again, they knew that things would happen. By 1979, of course, I mean, major secrets that they wanted to keep hidden had actually been exposed.
Thank you.
You both mentioned Burke Trend. He seems like quite a key figure. I'm just thinking about the importance of individuals in pushing forward the agenda, the openness agenda. Do you think, Declan, that he was a key official? And Gill, from your point of view, do you see this during your time, in office, certain individuals able to push forward this particular agenda?
Well, from my point of view, yes, I think he's the key individual. Partly it's because he pushes for the official history of intelligence itself, and again, his motivations are quite complicated. But he also pushes for things like SOE in France. He's a great supporter of MRD Foot's book, An SOE in France. He reads it, he's the first one who reads it, and then gives an incredibly flattering assessment of how good the book is to the government in 1966.
I think the other importance about Trend is that he had been cabinet secretary under Harold Wilson, and Wilson had pushed very hard for example, from the reduction of the 50-year rule to the 30-year rule and so on. And Trend had argued with him about it a bit, but I mean, Trend had, if you like, come through the Wilson. He'd agreed with Wilson in the end about Wilson was very keen to get more material out. And then when you get to the Heath government, Trend is still there. And he's got that sort of background behind him. And I think, generally all these things, there have been periods when somebody has taken up the openness, baton, if you like. I mean, for me, Jack Straw was a great champion of that. And without his intervention, we would never have got the PUSD records released, and that made a big difference. So there are always people who kind of get it. They get the importance of history. They get the importance of widening the scope of information that's available. Obviously, some don't, and some are more difficult. But I think individuals can make a big difference.
Well, certainly Wilson rather interestingly says about the 30-year rule. He says that if there's going to be complaints about what happened at this point in time, I'd rather be alive to defend myself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Great. If people do have comments or questions, do stick it in the chat or put your hand up. Gill, I just wondered, being an official historian, I mean, quite often you're caught in the middle because you're between the academics on one hand who think you're not being candid enough, and then your own departmental colleagues who think being too candid. Is that an uncomfortable position at all at any time? Or
well, I think you have to learn to do that one, really. I mean, I think in the end, you're never going to please everybody. It's just impossible. And, returning to the number of conspiracy theories that the historians have dealt with over the years, there's absolutely nothing you can do in the end, because if you say we've looked in the archive and there is nothing that says that supports this particular theory, they say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? You got, you can't make everybody happy. But my own personal experience is that overall, as long as you try, what you write and publish is presented, professionally and with scholarly rigor, then generally speaking, the academic community is glad to have what you've been allowed to see, because it's better than not having it at all. It doesn't mean that people won't complain, and I understand that, but I think it's better to have access and get access to material and get it out there where you can, even if you can't satisfy everybody's. I should have mentioned as well, if I just add this on, this question I mentioned about the legislation, but referencing what Declan said, the other big thing that was going on in the late 60s and the 70s and so on, the leading up to it, was campaigns by people like Peter Hennessy, then a journalist, who wrote a number of very important articles in the late 70s, talking about how it was a nonsense for the government to deny that there were intelligence agencies and so on. In fact, we were actually told not to have any contact with Peter in those days because he was dangerous. But and Chris Andrew himself, who published some very influential articles, because he proved that you can actually get an awful lot of information about intelligence from open sources if you look hard enough. And that cumulative, those pressures helped persuade ministers that actually you had to move towards avowing the agencies.
And Peter Henderson, I suppose William Waldegrave, another of those openness.
I mean, William too, but he wasn't so much specifically targeting intelligence in his initiative, but yes, it was very important.
I mean, this issue of being able to search through open sources, I mean, this is what the Insight team did.
Yes, absolutely.
1967. And they actually uncovered a great deal of Philby's career. I mean, simply by working through and finally actually finding people who were willing to talk about it, which again, enriched the actual piece of work itself. And then again, Philby's own memoirs, which are incredibly mendacious. I mean, in that sense, they're a political act as well. All of these annoyed the secret state to the point where they felt actually that really they needed to do something.
And the Insight team, of course, also published a big book on the Zinoviev letter. Now, unfortunately, some of the information they'd been given was not true, but it wasn't their fault. But in a way, that led to a more openness about, because it was felt that you had to respond to. Eventually, it took a long time to do it. You had to respond to that by trying to get hold of information that showed what, as far as you could work out what actually had happened. But no, I mean, I think the Insight team was a tremendous investigatory group. Hugo Young, of course, particularly when he was still alive.
Philip, did you have a question?
Yeah, there's something that's always puzzled me, and it's I was wondering if it had crossed Declan's radar or even Gill's, and it might seem like a niggling little point, but I think it opens up more broadly. So Declan talked about the importance of Philby's book and the investigative reporting around Philby from 67, 68. I've never quite worked out what the status was of this article that Hugh Trevor Roper published in Encounter in 68 on the back of that. But what he does is really sort of try and explain how SIS survived during the war. And he says, basically it survives because C had access, C was the person who brought the product of GCHQ to Churchill. So Hugh Trevor Roper starts to talk about GCHQ. He talks about the breaking of the Enigma machine. He talks about Polish resistance's role in that. And this is when supposedly no one knew about Bletchley Park, and no one supposedly talked about or wrote about Bletchley Park until the mid-70s. And I always wondered whether Hugh Trevor Roper's piece was partly officially inspired, but it also, I think, maybe points to the fact that I suspect that the British government was surprised that the Enigma secret didn't leak or didn't become widely discussed in the public domain until the mid-70s. Because, if you just reading between the lines of Philby's, of Hugh Trevor Roper's piece in 68, all of the clues seem to be there. I mean, Declan, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, certainly, if you look at Philby's book, he doesn't mention the enormous success of Enigma virtually at all. I mean, but then that's deliberate. I mean, it's again, his aim is to actually denigrate the service.
Yeah.
But having said that, yes, I mean, part of the reason SIS survived in the way that it did is essentially because C managed to get the material from Poland that actually gave them got them into the Enigma secret in the first place. But secondly, they actually managed to build, after having lost their entire human network in Europe in 1939, they managed very successfully on the back of occupied peoples to build an incredibly successful human network up to 1944. Particularly, a very enormous value to that is the Poles. The Poles in France were incredibly helpful there.
But I suppose my point is that I find it difficult to imagine that Trevor Roper wasn't being inspired by some people within the intelligence community to give out a few clues at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of what Chris Moran calls the counterblast.
Yeah.
Some kind of officially inspired leak that actually will divert attention away from other things that the state doesn't want to be known about. Having said that, it's quite clear at some point General Bertrand was going to publish something about the French breaking Enigma in 1970s. So at some point they knew that actually all of this would come out and that it couldn't be preserved. And again, we overstate the case when we say that, you know, GCHQ was listening into Enigma traffic post 1945, so they'd encouraged the sales of Enigma machines in the world. But they did. So using the UAR, the United Arab Republics, we were reading that Enigma traffic in the early 1970s. That's again, so I can't see that Trevor Roper would have published that as independently and off his own bat without actually somebody saying it's actually mentioning some of the successes to counterbalance or counterblast against Philby.
I think that I mean I accept that, but I also have a memory that they were actually pretty cross about. I mean, it's Encounter after all, which is we're talking about the Americans really. And there's always that difficulty, which has happened more than once, where the Americans are willing to let information out, as long as it's not theirs, of course. And also, Trevor Roper himself was not on very good terms with officialdom at that stage. You know, by the 60s, he's pretty disobliging about his previous activities. I'm not saying it's wrong but I do think it was not, in my experience, how they chosen to open the curtain a little bit. But you know, it's difficult to know exactly what went on there.
Well, Trevor Roper must have known that Masterman was trying to publish the double cross system for a long time, both in Oxford at the same time. And again, by the late 1960s, early 1970s, Masterman is gone to move over to publishing it in America. So yes, it might well be that is a case in point.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Donald Prentice. Donald, do you want to come in and ask your question? You're on mute, Donald.
Here we go. So, can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Oh, good. So I was just wondering if there's been any research, similar research, done either by the Russians of their own services. I came across a movie recently called 17 Weeks in Spring, which is a fact of fiction about Soviet intelligence inside the Abwehr during the 1940s. I was just wondering if somebody in Yasenyevo in Moscow has done some similar historical work. Presumably.
Oh, lots and lots. I mean, over the years, and 17 Weeks in Spring is quite famous, and there's a certain day in the year when everybody plays it. I can't remember exactly, but I have heard people giving a talk about this. I mean, there's always been extensive Soviet and later Russian research into its own history. Of course, we wouldn't necessarily agree with everything. The person who's done a huge amount of work on this is Philip Kovacevic at the University of San Francisco, who's really done a lot of research into, if you like, Russian research into the history of its own intelligence agencies. And his work is really in focus. He's a Russian speaker. And, you know, in fact, in my career, quite often the Russians would send us something which was supposed to be the truth about their some episode or another in their intelligence. Well, you know, as you can imagine, there was quite a lot of research on our side into how much credence one could actually place on that. But yeah, they're doing the same thing. I mean, I would just add that during the brief period where we were actually on rather good terms with the Russian archival authorities, which were really in the late 90s, you know, obviously after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but before Putin, they were very collaborative, and there were certain issues, particularly in my case, the Zinoviev letter, where they were very helpful and allowed us access to certain archives in Moscow, which we would certainly not have got before, and unfortunately not since.
Patrick, you've come on screen. Did you have a...
Yeah, if I may, just anecdotal really, but one aspect of Hinsley's work, which is perhaps of interest, is the fact that all the time he was writing or editing or working with others on those volumes, he was also supervising a huge number of PhD students in Cambridge, including me. And all of us were trawling through the open files, in the National Archives, and finding little snippets. And now and again, we would pass them to Harry. And I think at least one of mine actually got into a footnote. So I was rather pleased about that. But it was also an interesting time because it was when Chris Andrew was converting himself really from a French historian into a historian of British intelligence. And he was looking at the Zinoviev letter. So every week one had a seminar, very heavily attended, lots of people there in these chaotically organized rooms where the books were falling off the shelves, and the pipe smoke and all that. It was extremely unhealthy, but it was a very good atmosphere, and this went on week after week throughout the Cambridge term for several years.
And Peter Hennessy and Keith Jeffrey both they both also were being students of Hinsley, and they described an occasion in which they were both called in to Hinsley, who told them to jolly well stop campaigning against greater, that they were, because they were going to break the rules and they'd end up in jail, he warned them.
I only ever met Harry Hinsley once. I mean, that was when I was attending the course in Cambridge that this was running, and he spoke at it. He was a fascinating man. I mean, he really was quite remarkable in that sense.
Yes, did I ever tell you, my boy, how I sank the Bismarck? That was where he would start.
Very much so. Yes, I remember that. Yes, my boy business.
Fraser McGowan's got a question. Do you want to come in and ask it, Fraser? Or
yeah, I'm happy to ask it if you can hear me.
We can hear you. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I just wondered about the context of this question is that a lot of the conversation about openness is about classification and redaction. But I wondered if in the kind of 21st century, where more people are doing historical research online, whether digitization should be more of this discussion. I'm mainly a historian of US intelligence, and I noticed that in the US, a lot of the archives, particularly of the CIA, are available online. In fact, I think they're only available online through its searchable CREST database. And I wonder if the British government, the National Archives, have a similar approach, or whether they should have a similar approach in future, whether digitization should be more of a priority.
Well, I mean, they do have an extensive program of digitization, and indeed have digitized many intelligence records. I think capacity to do that is, they would say they can't do everything, but I agree, it's very helpful when you have got, I mean, for example, I mentioned the Corby case, the Gutsenko case, but all the MI5 files on that, very extensive files, are all available online to be downloaded, and there's other stuff too. But of course, it's true that the CIA have those there, but of course they are heavily redacted in places.
Well, this is the thing I found in looking at my records. I mean, it's a bit hit and miss in terms of what is digitized and what isn't. I mean, appears to be no clear, coherent policy about what constitutes a document to be digitized. But luckily, it's quite a lot. And if you find it, it's easy to download and it's easy to use. The other thing, if it's not, you have to go down to the archive.
Just a question then, Declan, to you on your sources. What, where are you deriving most of your information from? Is it TNA records that have been released, records released to TNA? Or?
The bulk of records from the TNA, the DFE series, the cabinet papers, some KV files from MI5, but principally it's DFE, I mean, particularly for decisions, and the cabinet papers, cabinet files, some Prem files as well.
Yeah. Any other questions from people? No, just another question to you then, Jill, about you mentioned this a little bit earlier about how difficult it is to prove a negative. You know, proving that something didn't happen when people say something did happen, or you don't have the records when people think you're sitting on, you know, secret treasure trove of information. There's nothing you can do about that, really, is there? It's just
well, there isn't, and of course, this is one of the things, particularly when you're dealing with foreign countries. You know, quite often official requests are made from other countries who would like, you know, who say, well, they want access to the intelligence archives. Well, I mean, they're just not going to be given that access. And as you know, that's sometimes been our role to act as the intermediary. But of course, then, well, if there aren't any, this was a case in point with the Poles, because they argued that because during the war, SIS was handling, if you like, the Polish exiled intelligence material. They had a section that dealt with Polish affairs. They argued that all their records must still be sitting in SIS specifically. Well, I mean, the answer was they weren't, and indeed we had some documentation, fortunately, to prove that you know, the basically flimsy copies of stuff had all been destroyed at the end of the war. Because actually, I mean, one of the things that, again, we have to keep repeating about is that all the intelligence agencies say we're not here in the business of creating an archive. That's not what we're here for. We collect information, we collect intelligence for our operational purposes. And sometimes when we've used it, we finish with it, we get rid of it because we don't need it anymore. Well, that's of course very frustrating to historians, but it means that, you know, there are big gaps. We're talking about SIS specifically because they don't transfer their records to the public domain. But, you know, it's very difficult to persuade those who are convinced you must have it that you haven't. And I don't see there's really much you can do about that.
Well, that's the problem with conspiracy theories. They don't have to be true.
No.
Really plausible.
No.
It's the plausibility that actually gives them a long life. And people who want to believe conspiracy theories will believe them regardless of whatever.
Well, you know, an episode that I sometimes quote is that years ago now, after he had been chief of SIS, Sir John Scarlett was giving a talk, an open talk to somebody else was giving a talk. He was asked a question about Princess Diana, the death of Princess Diana, as you know, object of many conspiracy theories, and he said something which I often cite because I think it's important. Is he said, on the one hand, most people in this country think it's silly to believe that MI6 would have killed Princess Diana. On the other hand, those same people believe there must be something in it because it's been in the media, and that a lot of people are entirely capable of holding both those beliefs at the same time. And you have to remember that. I mean, Princess Diana is just an example, but I think it's true. You know, it's why it's so difficult to stamp out these things. The only one of these things, well, in fact, two of all our conspiracies that I ever remember us really putting to bed was the first one was the Roger Casement diaries, where when they developed some very new, sophisticated testing, scientific testing of the documents, and were able to prove roughly when they would have been written. And the other one was, of course, the Romanovs, when they found the graves and were able to find the bodies. But all the others, you can't be sure they're not going to pop up again anytime soon.
No, not at all.
Well, we shall get started on the rumours around the current Princess of Wales. So,
yeah, well, there you are. And of course, the internet and the availability of you know, instant information, supposedly, on anything, it just makes everything much more difficult.
It's almost time to wrap up, but does anybody have any last questions before we do? In which case, it just remains for me to say thanks to both Declan and Gill for two fascinating presentations. giving us their views on researching intelligence history from two very different perspectives, the insider practitioner and the external academic historian. And you know, go some way towards putting together a bigger picture of official history and its uses that we're trying to, you know, tease out in this seminar series. I just see Tony Addison has just come in with a late question. So just before we go, I'll ask the question: how much has been published on economic intelligence? He's aware of Peter Davis's book. Does anybody have a quick answer?
A certain amount, I think, is it depends on what you mean by economic intelligence. But I mean, obviously, there's a lot of work on. I mean, I still find when I was working on that, it was with because Desmond Morton was very much he actually ran the economic intelligence section in SIS before he went to work for Churchill. That actually Professor Medlicott's official history of the economic blockade, in fact, includes a lot on the economic intelligence. But there are other books as well. Greg Kennedy has done work on this as well. And indeed Wesley Walk in Canada. So there are information, but it is, you know, it is a bit of a niche area, but it's an important one. I agree.
I'd support that. I mean, I don't really know enough about the literature at all to make more than that kind of comment, but I would support everything you said, Jill.
Okay, I hope that satisfies you, Tony. Thanks again to both Gill and Declan. Please do join us again for our session on Wednesday, the 24th of April, on historical engagement with policymakers. I look forward to seeing you all there. And until then, everybody have a good Easter break and have a very good evening. Thanks for joining.